director of ASTR, Adventist Statistics, and come on, help me, David.
Archive Statistics and Research.
Archives, Statistics. Come. You know that English is not my first language, so sometimes I do get a little confused. But thank you for being with us tonight. Looking forward to hearing.
Thank you very much, Mike Dill. Good evening, brothers and sisters. And those words are particularly appropriate in a place such as this. It's unfortunate that I've been given a job title that no one can remember. Except me. ASTR is easier to say. And I'm just going to do something dangerous and briefly improvise. But sitting here, I was struck by the fact that we are following so literally in the footsteps of our pioneers, because in May 1863, when this church was founded, they met on May 20 and 21 for business meetings, but they hadn't finished, and yet they adjourned until May 23, and they all went the next 2 days into a big tent that was pitched on Battle Creek Green where they were conducting evangelistic meetings. Does that not say something about the Seventh-day Adventist Church? So here we are in a big tent pitched on something like the green of Battle Creek, literally following in our forefathers and foremothers' footsteps. From the Apostle Paul's epistle to the Romans, chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Therefore, I beseech you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God. This is your true and proper service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may test and prove what the will of God is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. This is the word of the Lord. On November 3, 1920, Eva Clements died in Rangoon, the capital city of Burma, today's Yangon in Myanmar. And I think if we can move on. You see here what was then called Rangoon in the 1920s. We know little of the life of Eva Clements, and there is no known photograph of her. She had been born on July 25, 1897, near Bundaberg in northern Queensland, then a British colony, though when she was 3 it became a state of a new nation, Australia. We know nothing more about her until September 1914, when at the age of 16, Eva took a position in the headquarters of the Australasian Union Conference in Sydney. She worked there for more than 5 years in stenographic, secretarial work until in January 1920 she was called to serve as stenographer to the president of the Southern Asia Division in Lucknow, India. She was an administrative assistant, we would say in the General Conference today, and today we would not call an international service employee, as we call missionaries, to work in a clerical capacity. But in 1920 there were merely 1,000 members across the whole of India, and probably no local believer who combined stenographic experience with familiarity in the language of denominational administration, which then as now was a particular dialect. The fact that the call for a stenographer went to Eva suggests something about her character, and it suggests she was good at her work. So does the fact that when people spoke of Eva, and there's not many times we find it, but there are a few, they regularly call her devoted to her work. And they speak of to the Adventist message. And so Eva accepted the call, and on March 3, 1920, she departed Sydney on the P&O steamer Mantua, which you see on the screen, sailing for Bombay via Melbourne and Colombo. Having landed in what today is Mumbai, she took the train for the 880-mile journey to Lucknow, where she arrived safely on March 29, 1920. It was only 84 days since the General Conference Committee had voted to approve the request of John E. Fulton, the division president, that, quote, Australia supply a stenographer to India. Fulton had only arrived in India himself the previous year, but he'd been president of the Australasian Union and he knew Eva, and it's likely that he proposed her in particular as the stenographer to be sent. If so, it suggests that she had expressed interest in mission service already, but we don't really know for sure. Eva seems to have settled well into her life in Lucknow. According to her obituary, she entered heartily into her work at the Lucknow office and much enjoyed life. And she was popular among her new colleagues thanks to what one called a bright disposition and a spirit of helpfulness. A former colleague in Sydney recalled that in her letters from Lucknow, she had no complaints to make concerning the climate or culture in India, while in one of those letters, Eva wrote, "I want to tell you that I am glad I came to India." She had been there for less than 5 months when on around August 31st, she left with Fulton's wife, Susan, on an itinerary to Burma, then part of the Southern Asia Division. They were intending to meet in Rangoon with John Fulton, who was then in southern India. But Susan and Eva traveled separately, first by rail from Lucknow to Kolkata. Remember that, we'll come back to it at the end. And then by ship to the port town of Mulmeen in southeast Burma, and finally by small boat up the great Salween River to Kamamong, a remote mission station where they stayed for 2 or 3 weeks. They stayed with the Fulton's daughter Agnes and her husband, this man Eric B. Hare, later to become legendary for his mission story. Lucknow was a huge city, a center of culture and civilization for centuries, celebrated by writers such as Rudyard Kipling. At Kamamong, they were 80 miles from the nearest European. Eva, I would guess, thought, now I'm really getting into the mission field. She and Mrs. Fulton enjoyed the time, but Eva suffered from fever. Still, it seemed to pass, and in October they moved to Rangoon, where they met Elder Fulton, who had a series of meetings culminating at the end of the month in a 10-day meeting, general meeting of the Burma Union Mission that had only been founded the year before. Now, even though Fulton was away from the office, he was still transacting presidential business. Some of you know how that goes. And so, in early October, Eva was kept busy with presidential correspondence. Later in the month, as Mrs. Fulton later recalled, she spent much time writing programs for meetings and copying budgets. And Eva kept up this work, Susan Fulton wrote, almost to the day she died. For unfortunately, Eva developed appendicitis and had to be admitted to Rangoon General Hospital. On the penultimate morning of that union session, which was a Sabbath, October 30, 1920, she had her appendix removed, apparently without complications. Now, Rangoon General Hospital was a modern institution. She ought to have recovered, but the fever contracted in Kamamong continued to affect her. It had weakened her. And in fact, visiting her the night before the operation, the Fultons noted that though she was quite cheerful, she was anxious, quote, that her illness might terminate fatally. And sadly, her concern was just. On the night of the 31st, she slipped into a coma. She never regained consciousness. In the early morning of November 3, 1920, she passed away. Without the strain and sickness that arose from her missionary service, Eva would almost certainly have successfully recuperated from a relatively routine surgery. As Susan Fulton wrote, her term of service in India was short indeed. Full of grief, Fulton wrote too, "We cannot understand why one so young, so eager to serve, so greatly needed in the mission field, should be so suddenly taken away from us." Eva Clements was just 23 years old. She'd been in the mission field for just 7 months. From the time her call was voted by the General Conference to the time she was buried was a mere 10 months. And perhaps some of you, having listened to me, may be thinking, why tell this story in Battle Creek? What's the point? What's its significance? Surely there must be a catch. There's going to be a surprise ending. There must be something to explain why I'm telling you this sad little story of a long-forgotten woman. Did she have children, perhaps, that I haven't mentioned yet? Did she have a cousin who became a division president or a GC departmental director? Did a niece grow up and, inspired by stories of Aunt Eva, become an immensely successful missionary somewhere else? Did her staunchness in death inspire onlookers so much that a local government official or tribal leader became converted? The answer is no, no, no. She had no children, no famous relatives, and her death had an impact on only a small circle. Eva May lived in near anonymity. She died in obscurity, and she rests in a neglected cemetery, far from her original home, far even from the adopted home and the colleagues who had barely got to know her. Circumstances conspired to consign Eva Clements to oblivion. Her friends and family back in Australia grieved when the telegram arrived, but their lives moved on. So why do I tell this story? Partly because Eva is not alone in not being remembered. Too often we tell the same few stories from Adventist history. Perhaps there's a particular danger of that in Battle Creek. But Adventist history is deep, and it is wide, and it is full of stories of dedicated men and women who quite literally took their lives in their hands, but did so because they had put their lives in the hands of the Holy Spirit. And so they were willing to risk danger, deprivation, disease, death. And in many cases, they truly gave their all so that the prophetic messages of the angels of Revelation 14 might be proclaimed, that this church might be built up and that Jesus might be lifted up. And yet those people are generally moldering in obscurity. And so another reason for starting with Eva's fatal story is because though forgotten for so long, some parts of her story can be recovered, as I just did with you. We know almost nothing of what she thought or what she felt. But at least we can piece together a timeline for the last year of her life to a degree that's impossible for many others. And there were many, many other missionaries who died while in the mission field. And Eva stands for them, and in particular for the many who passed away soon after arriving overseas. And I'll tell you some of their stories. I'll summarize them quickly. The lives of people about whom little is known other than their sacrifices and their suffering. Eva's experiences can stand in some sense for theirs. They serve to remind us that every missionary had a story. No matter how anonymous their decease, they were wives and daughters, sons and husbands, beloved in life, lamented in death. And so I also tell this story partly because the tragedy it represents was not uncommon. It is not just Eva's poignant, premature death, but its apparent pointlessness, which makes it tragic. Eva May Clements never accomplished great deeds for Jesus, but she never had the chance to. She did her work diligently and cheerfully, but before she could achieve anything noteworthy, she was cut down in the prime of life because she was willing to give her life in order that others might have eternal life. And in that willingness to serve, to risk literally life and limb, her life was surely not pointless, not in the eyes of her Heavenly Father, but also, I hope, not in your eyes. I tell the stories of Eva and of many other martyrs to Adventist mission to remind us of the true foundations of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. When it was established 155 years ago, its 3,500 members were only found in the northeast and midwest of the United States, with a handful in Canada. Today, its members are found in almost every country of the world. And today we can too easily take that outcome for granted because we know how the story turned out. but commitment and sacrifice were required to a degree that today is rare. Past generations of Adventists willingly undertook what Paul calls the Christian's proper service to God, presenting their bodies as living sacrifices. So this evening we're stressing the sacrifices and commitment of missionaries, but I also will be highlighting the fact that in our first 100 years, there was rarely a shortage of recruits willing to pay the ultimate price. Friends, there is still a worldwide need for service. Still areas where the Adventist presence is minimal and tenuous. Places where missionaries have a vital part to play, not in large institutions, but in coming close to people by personal effort. The words of Ellen G. White in Ministry of Healing. We still need missionaries today. The stories of Eva Clements and other forgotten heroes of this church, the ones who did not become division or GC officers or departmental directors, but who gave their lives both literally and figuratively, their stories have a power still to move us, I think. They have the power to inspire both young and old to recommit to the prophetic mission of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Friends, today we often have a very romanticized view of mission service. This is partly because our knowledge comes from mission stories, whether those told to camp meeting audiences by returned missionaries such as Eric B. Hare, or those published as didactic and inspirational short books by church publishing houses in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the sorts of books I grew up reading, and I suspect quite a number of you did. While many of these stories do say something about the risks missionaries took, the stories remain upbeat, stressing divine blessing in the face of distress and difficulties, and they gloss over suffering. Burnished by time and the storyteller's art, even disagreeable conditions and deadly dangers could take on a lustrous glow. In the 21st century, we overlook the dangers of mission service in the 19th and 20th centuries when the Adventist Church began to expand around the world. In 1902, William Spicer, then Secretary of the Foreign Mission Board, set the situation out starkly but candidly. Those who go into the fields must be ready to lay down their lives, and at the least must be ready to lay everything they have upon the altar of service. And in writing thus, Spicer was being neither sentimental nor theoretical, for he had been a missionary himself, and he had suddenly and unexpectedly become superintendent of the India mission when its first superintendent, Doris Robinson, died of smallpox, a story we'll come back to. But Spicer knew of what he spoke. We forget that going as a missionary meant taking one's life in one's hands. Now, this is true for everyone. In 1900, there were 17,400 Christian missionaries worldwide. 1900 is, of course, just before the GC headquarters left Battle Creek. Of those 17,500 almost missionaries, more than 92% were from Western countries. Only 1 in 6 of those was working in Africa because of the high risk of disease and death. At this stage, one historian writes, there were still no answers to the killer diseases, malaria and sleeping sickness. In West Africa, the casualty rate among Western missionaries at this time was so high that they were expected to live 2 years. And this poor life expectancy was true of Adventist missionaries too. They often quickly succumbed to and frequently died of a range of tropical diseases, fevers, and other often unknown infectious diseases. And this is the case all around the world, not just in West Africa. The 2-year average, of course, implies both shorter and longer lifespans, but clustering around the 2-year mark. So Eva Clements was far from unique in that short period she served as a missionary. And I'm going to give you a number of actual examples from Southern Asia, the islands of the South Pacific, the Middle East, Central America, and the Caribbean. I could, if time permitted, have added many, many more examples, and from Southeast Asia and East Asia as well. The brief snippets of missionary lives cut short, sometimes apparently to no end, bring home the cost of service, and may lead us to wonder, is the spirit of sacrifice for mission, of sacrifice to enter unentered countries, to reach unreached and underreached peoples, is that spirit of sacrifice still alive? Or is it, like many of the missionaries in our past, now sickening, ailing, failing? On October 3, 1895, a party of 4 American missionaries disembarked at the port of Cape Coast, which you see here in what was then called the Gold Coast, a British colony in West Africa, today's Ghana. These 4 missionaries joined a body of local believers started by Francis Dolphine, who asked for a missionary to be sent. And you can see him here. He is standing in the middle and in the back, the man standing at the back. But Dolphine had asked for missionaries, and so they were sent. Dudley Hale was the leader, the man sitting on the right as you look at him. With him were G.P. Riggs, of whom no photograph survives, and the man sitting next to Hale with his wife behind him, George and Eva Kerr. Also with them were the Kerrs' 2 children who are not pictured. Within 8 months of their arrival, remember it was October 3, 1895, within 8 months both children had died, and Hale and Riggs had both been shipped to Liverpool in England for treatment. Hale for malaria, Riggs for severe dysentery. Riggs was eager to return, but he never recovered despite the treatment, and he died on January 8, 1897. From Riggs's arrival at Cape Coast to his death in Liverpool was just 15 months. Hale recovered and eventually returned to the Gold Coast in 1903, but was again forced by malaria to leave almost immediately, but still, he lived. In 1909, this man, C.E.F. Thompson, a Jamaican, went with his wife as a missionary to the Gold Coast. Perhaps IAD's first foreign missionary, and also perhaps the best-dressed Adventist of the early 20th century as you look at him. Sadly, the 2-year window applied to Thompson. In the first 24 months, he won some 30 converts, but then he contracted kidney disease. He went to Freetown, Sierra Leone to seek treatment, but on March 25, 1912, he died, leaving his wife a widow. In 1908, Thomas and Catherine French, both teachers, accepted a call to work in education in Sierra Leone, arriving there in May 1908. Both suffered from malaria there, but they survived. But after 2.5 years, they were moved to the Gold Coast, Ghana, and to the mission station of Axim, where Thompson had worked. And they had been there only a few days when on January 17, 1911, Catherine was taken ill with a severe attack of black water fever, as her husband Thomas described it. She lived just 1 more day, dying of heart failure on January 18, 1911. In describing her passing, Thomas evokes both the bewilderment and the distress, and yet somehow also the determination that is typical of many Adventist missionaries who faced his situation. He wrote, "As I stood beside my dying companion a few days ago and realized my own strength was fast failing, in my perplexity my mind turned to my brethren and sisters at home who so nobly support this cause by their prayers and by their means, and the question came forcibly to me, what can this crisis mean? We appeal to our people at home to support the languishing hands of our workers in these heathen strongholds. Brethren and sisters, seek God earnestly in behalf of his cause in West Africa." God's cause needed to be upheld in other parts of Africa too, of course. And in other parts of Africa too, missionaries faced their mortality. On July 5, 1894, a party of 7 Seventh-day Adventists had arrived in Bulawayo, new capital of the most recent acquisition of the British Empire, Rhodesia, covering today Zambia and Zimbabwe. The Adventists established a mission station at Solusi in Zimbabwe. Now, most of them returned soon after to South Africa, leaving, this is the university today, and they left a South African layman, Fred Sparrow, in charge of the property. In July 1895, a year later, a second party of missionaries arrived. It included Elder George B. Tripp, who became the first superintendent of the Solusi mission. It also included his wife Mary and son George Jr. Mary was the boy's stepmother, and she and George Sr. had only married in March, immediately before departing America for South Africa. And as we'll see, this is true for many missionaries. They married right before leaving for foreign service. Other missionaries in the 1895 party included Elder William H. Anderson and his wife Nora, Dr. A.S. Carmichael, and Fred Sparrow's brother, Chris, and his wife, Mahala, who helped to manage the mission farm. And here you see Chris Sparrow and the African workers on the farm from Solusi. They all worked there for nearly 3 years. In 1897, Frank Armitage, another American missionary, joined them with his wife Annie and their daughter Violet. Annie was the younger sister of GC President Ola Olson. She and Frank were both 33, and they both served as missionaries less than 12 months. For in 1898, a malaria epidemic swept across Britain's Rhodesian colonies. Dr. Carmichael contracted the disease on February 14, and 2 weeks later he died. The Tripp family all fell ill, and though Mary Tripp survived on March 7, George died. You see his grave pictured here. And on the same day, so did Chris Sparrow's young daughter, whose name is not even known. Her mother, Mahala, was laid to rest by the side of her daughter in the cemetery at Solusi. On April 8, George Tripp Jr. died and was buried next to his father. You see here the graves, which are still at Solusi. They still lie there, silent, awaiting the return of Christ. And I'm grateful to Gideon Reinecker of SID for these photos. Meanwhile, Annie Armitage had been taken seriously ill. It was decided to send, remember this is the GC president's sister, it was decided to send her to Cape Town, but even though they took the expense of sending her on the newly constructed railroad, she never made it. She died en route. Dr. William Anderson, who survived, wrote a report that was published in the Review and Herald. He stressed that the epidemic had carried off not just missionaries alone, but also many local believers, and it was about them who he was concerned. Not merely their mortal lives, but their eternal futures. Oh, for men and women to give their lives, if need be, for this people, he wrote. We need young men and women, those who can stand the change of climate, who can easily acquire the language, or as today we would say, get used to the culture, who are strong in faith and who do not easily yield to discouragement. We need those who are willing to leave their country, kindred and homes to lead others to the promised land. In April 1912, Charles Lindsay Nelson, known as Lynn, his wife Ida, who was 5 years younger, and their daughter Ethel, sailed for South Africa. They took up station at Tsungwezi Mission, in what was also Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. And here you see, no you don't see, I apologize. Not to worry. Well, we have photos of them, but taken 7 years later when they were a widow and orphan. Because in 1913 there was an outbreak of smallpox at Tsungwezi, and Lynn contracted the disease. His wife recorded he had complications which made it difficult and painful for him to breathe. On June 2 he died, aged 32, leaving Ida a widow at age 35. News of his, and this shows how communication spread, news of his death was received the next day at the 1913 General Conference session. Ida had sent a telegram with this simple but deeply sad message: my husband died yesterday at 1 p.m. He had served at Tsungwezi just a year. It was not Africa alone where Adventist pioneers risked death. It was a danger too in the same hemisphere as the homeland that many of them had. For example, David C. Babcock and his wife Elmira, American missionaries, arrived in British Guyana in February 1900. Elmira died on June 20, 1901, after only 4 months. Albert and Ida Fisher, who pastored near the location of the current GC headquarters in Maryland, went as missionaries to the newly acquired American colony of Puerto Rico. They disembarked there in October 1901. Less than 6 months later, Albert died of typhoid fever. He was 31. And another missionary in Puerto Rico, A.J. Hazemer, wrote back to the States. Albert, this is a picture of his wife from her passport, but Hazemer wrote back that Albert was afraid that many would think that he and his wife had made a mistake in coming to this field. He wished me to express his strong belief that the Lord had sent them, and to state that he didn't regret the move they had taken, but that if the Lord should call him aside to rest a while, he was glad to be found at his post of duty. Charles W. Enoch, a nurse and masseur who worked at Portland Sanitarium in Oregon, was inspired to go as a self-supporting missionary to the Caribbean with his brother, George. They landed at Port of Spain, Trinidad, in January 1907 and opened treatment rooms. But on February 6, 1907, Charles died of yellow fever. He served in Trinidad maybe a month. Ovid Davis, who had actually succeeded Babcock as superintendent of the Guyana mission in 1906, wrote grimly, "This makes 3 of our workers laid away in Port of Spain." But George was almost upbeat, using words similar to those Hazemer used about Fisher. "I am thankful," George wrote of Charles, "that he died at his post of duty. I'm glad, or thankful. We have no regrets to offer, but take this bereavement as one more link to bind our lives on the altar of missionary endeavor." George Enoch acknowledges that our hearts are bowed in sadness, but his real concern is evident when he writes, "Still the thought presses heavily upon us, will this branch of the work in the West Indies, which we," he and his brother, "strove together so hard to get upon its feet, be now left to languish for the lack of consecrated workers?" Again and again, missionaries cared as much for the future of the work as for themselves or their friends and family. Other islands far from the Caribbean were also dangerous places in terms of disease. In 1903, Dr. Alfred M. Vollmer and his wife Maud accepted a call to serve at the Adventist Sanitarium in Samoa. As his obituary in the review records, he was in Samoa only 2 years. He contracted tuberculosis, and in 1905 he was sent back to the States for treatment. Although the report continues, the Lord was merciful and spared his life to reach home on the voyage. Vollmer, it says, suffered a great deal the last few weeks of his life, and he did not long survive the return, dying on February 15, 1906, aged just 30 years of age, leaving a widow and young orphaned daughter. In 1915, to move from one South Pacific island to another, in 1915, Norma Wiles, a recent graduate of Australasian Missionary College, today's Avondale, was called to serve in the New Hebrides, today's nation of Vanuatu. Norman immediately proposed to Alma Butts, herself the daughter of missionaries to the South Pacific, and they were married. In 1916, they went to Vanuatu. Norman was then aged 23 and Alma 22. They were threatened with being killed and consumed in a cannibal feast, but they won the local people over, and Norman suffered a different fate. After 4 years of service, on May 1, 1920, Norman suddenly succumbed to blackwater fever. He contracted it May 1. On May 5, he died, aged 27. Alma buried her husband with the help of the locals, and then returned to the mission headquarters alone. In 1915, 2 young Australians, Hubert Tolhurst and his wife Pearl, were married. You can see Pearl here with her family 8 years earlier. She's the one on the far right as you look at it. When they married, Hubert was 25 and Pearl was 24, and within weeks of their wedding, they sailed for Tonga, where they set up a mission station on an isolated island group known as the Ha'apai. In 1919, the islands were touched by an appalling epidemic, pneumonic plague, the Black Death that affected 14th century Europe. As an obituary describes, Hubert and Pearl toiled long hours ministering to the sick and stricken people and then succumbed to the plague themselves. Pearl died on March 14, 1919, after weeks of illness. She was the first student from Avondale College to give her life in mission service in the New Hebrides. She was just 28. She had been in the islands 4 years. And as one of her friends later recalled, alone, Hubert washed his wife's body, dressed it, dug a grave, conducted the funeral service, and then buried her. Two other graduates of Australasian Missionary College, Elsie Morgan and Clarence Davis, married early in 1915, planning to go as missionaries to China. They landed at Nanjing on September 30, 1915, and as one of their colleagues wrote, Clarence little thought they would be permitted to live together but 6 weeks in the mission field. Elsie died Nanjing, we'd say today, November 12, 1915, after a brief illness of but 10 hours, and this again is from her obituary. She was only 22, and she died before she'd seen barely anything of the world, much less her chosen mission field. But as so often, her passing was used as an occasion to urge greater missionary effort. In the obituary, her dying words are reported, "Jesus knows all about it, and it's all right." She and Clarence were among the first Australian missionaries to go to China, and Elsie was the first of them to die. The obituary posed a rhetorical question. May not her death be a call to the young men and women of the Australasian Union to consecrate their lives for service in the needy Orient? It was not only Westerners who went as missionaries and died. Benny Tavodi, a Fijian convert, went as a missionary to Dutch New Guinea, what today is Indonesia, in June 1908. He served there for more than a decade, but in October 1918 he died in Papua of snakebite. If the tropical zones were particularly dangerous, however, missionary service was dangerous anywhere, including in regions that are better known for deserts than for jungle. For example, in January 1904, J.G. Teschner, a German male nurse of whom almost nothing is known, had arrived in Jerusalem, where he used to work in the church's clinic there. Less than 6 months later, he died of fever. The Review and Herald reported he had but landed in Syria when he was called to lay down his armor. In 1902, William Wakeham and his wife Emma were called to Egypt, where Wakeham was superintendent of the Oriental Union Mission. They served in the Middle East for 4 years, and in this photo you can see William with a group of Armenian church workers he was training. He is, of course, seated in the front row towards the right. But then came a time during which, a colleague wrote, the family were exposed to many hardships and suffered from smallpox and other diseases. But, he wrote, Sister Wakeham, being a trained nurse, was able by the Lord's help to bring her children through this trying ordeal, but with the extreme heat of Egypt, in addition to what she had otherwise endured, her health broke. On May 6, 1906, they took ship for Southampton, hoping that the sea voyage, and this is what her husband wrote, hoping that the sea voyage would enable her, would relieve her. And at the time, her husband wrote, she was suffering a rapid breaking down of all the vital powers. They hoped treatment in England would effect a cure, but she died off the coast of Spain. She was buried at sea on May 13, and Wakeham emotionally recorded the death Of my dear wife Emma in her 46th year. Friends, remember, these are Victorians, Edwardians. They don't give themselves to emotional language. You have to pick out the emotion from between the slightly restrained words. But Wakeham continued to pay tribute. She has always been a loving wife, a devoted mother, an unselfish and untiring worker for suffering humanity. 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, feel keenly this great loss. With hearts sad and sore, yet buoyed up by the blessed hope, we committed her body to old ocean's arms, confident that although no monument marks her resting place, she will not be overlooked when the life-giver calls the sleeping saints. But he concluded this way: we do not know the meaning of this bereavement. Our loss, Egypt's loss. The same year, a medical missionary, Dr. Arthur George, became director of the Turkish mission. Within 2 years, he had developed a bad case of tuberculosis, but George clung to his work too long for the good of his health, as a fellow missionary observed. In the end, a successor was called from North America, Claude Moody, but George was so ill that he had to leave 2 weeks before Moody arrived. He was carried on a bed to a train and taken by train to Switzerland, but he'd left it too late. He passed away in February 1907. He had served in Turkey less than 12 months. Claude Moody had arrived in Constantinople, today's Istanbul, in November 1906. You can see him here. I've highlighted him with the white arrow. This photograph, which we have in the archives, on the back simply says, "A group of believers in Asia Minor, Elder Claude Moody standing in rear." By the end of 1908, also only 2 years after his arrival, Moody was, he wrote to church leaders in Washington, D.C., so afflicted by poor health that I find it necessary to make immediate plans to come to America. And he did, in fact, return to America in January 1909. But his health was permanently affected, and he died on July 23, 1911. Now, George and Moody had their situations exacerbated by a tendency to overwork, which was typical of many missionaries. Now, it was common among many Adventist leaders all around the world, something that couldn't possibly happen today, of course. There was a gradual laugh there. But overwork was particularly prevalent in the mission fields because there were far fewer Adventists, and so far greater burdens fell on those who were leading the mission work. Overwork was undoubtedly a contributing factor in the death in India of Doris Robinson, the first superintendent of the India mission who I mentioned earlier. And in fact, the Southern Asia Division is home to the remains of many Adventist missionaries. Robinson, who you see here, had been a missionary to South Africa, to Britain, and India, but when he died, it was not alone. Frederick W. Brown, a nurse, and his wife Catherine, a teacher, had sailed for India on December 14, 1898. They arrived at Calcutta on February 9, 1899, where they joined the staff of the mission located at Beau Bazaar Street. Here you see a group photo that, unfortunately, it doesn't include Fred and Catherine. In the summer of 1899, they were sent northwest to Ranchi, the capital of Bihar province. And in the autumn, a smallpox epidemic broke out in Bihar. But the Brown family refused to leave the region, which many Europeans did. Instead, the Browns, along with the Robinsons, you see here Doris and his wife Edna, they went to Karmata, where there was a small Adventist school and orphanage and almost no European medical care, and they started caring for smallpox victims. All 4 contracted the disease. Edna Robinson and Katie Brown suffered but survived. Their husbands both died. On December 21, 1899, Fred Brown passed away. He had been serving as a missionary in India for 10 months. The next month, his former classmates at Battle Creek in their graduation, Battle Creek Hospital and College, voted a resolution that his life and death shall be to us an inspiration to continue steadfastly in the work in which he has fallen, to bear the good news of salvation from sin, good news of salvation from sin and suffering to earth's needy ones. Meanwhile, on December 29, not long after Fred, Doris Robinson passed away too, having served in India for 3 years. Willie White wrote, "Overwork had unfitted him to battle with so dread a disease." Robinson's deputy, William Spicer, travelled up from Kolkata, and he later wrote, "I was with him in his last conscious hours. I told him that if he must lay down his work, perhaps God would use that to draw attention to India's needs. He replied with his swollen lips, 'Perhaps, I hope.'" They were his last words, and expressed his hope, a blessed hope, that the third angel's message would suffuse India. 21 years later, of course, Eva Clements died in Rangoon, and her death in November 1920, remember just 7 months into her service, ended a bad 2 years for the Southern Asia Division, during which 7 church workers died. They included Edith Bruce, a missionary nurse who at least was a veteran missionary, having served in India since 1908. She died on October 12, 1920, 98 years ago tomorrow, at the age of 53. Her obituary paid a moving tribute, which is typical of how missionary deaths were regarded by their fellow workers. "We laid her to rest on the quiet slope of the lower ranges of the mighty Himalayas, until those ancient mountains shall catch the gleam of the bright morning, when Jesus shall come to redeem from the grave the saints whose death is so precious in his sight, and whose last resting place he marks so tenderly." And to these 7 dead in India and Burma, we could add Ernest Chapman, who didn't die in India but in his homeland of Australia. He and his wife Elsie had only landed in India on November 9, 1920, and by October the following year, Ernie was suffering so badly from tuberculosis that Elsie had to write his letters home for him. He couldn't hold a pen. On December 5, 1920, only 13 months after their arrival, the Chapmans sailed for Australia in hope that he would be cured there, but the hope was in vain. Ernest died in Perth on January 6, 1922. Friends, in 1919 and 1920, there were 110 missionaries, Adventist missionaries, in India and Burma. So this means that the average annual mortality rate, which is deaths per 1,000, the average annual mortality rate among Adventist missionaries to India in those 2 years was 83. Now, I've looked at studies by historical demographers, and this mortality rate contrasts sharply with that of Westerners in general, even though in 1919 India was suffering the influenza epidemic. But in 1919 and 1920, the death rate for Westerners in India was 25 deaths per 1,000. In other words, it was more than 3 times as dangerous to be an Adventist missionary as to be another Westerner. And in fact, we can see from this chart the annual number of missionary deaths in the mission field each year from 1903 through 1939, when the Second World War started. Having spent so much time with dying missionaries, I not only commend to you their spirit of sacrifice, I also want to draw attention to this fact. Despite the death toll, Seventh-day Adventists were not deterred from taking the place of deceased missionaries. Or rather, if some Adventists were daunted by high missionary mortality rates, there were always enough volunteers to replenish the fallen. And you can see in this chart, it compares the numbers of new missionaries going out, and you can see the death at the bottom is always very low. But notice the hundreds of missionaries who are going out. There were always more men and women, usually young men and women, willing to go. But at the same time, let's not understate what they were signing up to do. This third chart, I hope, brings home powerfully the death toll, which is calculated here as deaths per 100 missionaries sent. The death toll was considerable. And if the mortality rate of Adventist missionaries in India after World War I was bad, the death toll of Adventist missionaries in general up to World War II was such that no one could be sanguine about going to a mission field. And yet committed men and women still did go to the mission field, and they remained there for very, very long periods. 20 years, 30 years, 50 years when they lived. Here's the amazing thing. These people went as missionaries and they stayed in these countries knowing the likely outcome. They went as missionaries knowing it was likely to be a death sentence. The sources of much of the information and most of the quotations that I've shared with you this evening are reports written on their deaths and published in the church papers of the mission homelands. So every Adventist grew up reading the stories of the sacrifices, the suffering, the early deaths of missionaries. This was part and parcel of growing up to be an Adventist, knowing that going as a missionary meant you could well die. In fact, the issue of the Australasian Record that prints a brief notice saying Eva Clements has been called to the Southern Asia Division. That same issue prints a story about an Australian missionary to India who had just arrived home very ill and was being treated. So people knew, and yet they were not deterred. We need to draw to a conclusion. I will pose and answer a question, and then I'll make a final point. Why did so many Adventist missionaries die? Overwork was a factor, and I could actually give a separate presentation on church workers who were workaholics and died early as a result. Maybe that will be for a future annual council. But there's another reason. Adventist missionaries of the late 19th and early 20th centuries did not remain in enclaves or in institutions. They got out and they got their hands dirty. They worked for the local people and they worked among the local people. Many Westerners, influenced by racism, tried to seclude themselves as much as possible from indigenous populations. Seventh-day Adventists didn't. They wanted to be among the people as much as possible so that they could emulate the teaching and healing ministry of Jesus Christ. In consequence, they were exposed to disease, and often they died. They died because they wanted to tell people of their Savior. And it is with their passion for sharing good news, a passion for saving souls, that we will end. And again, I could multiply quotations here, and I'll only share 3. In 1899, Fred Brown, who, as we saw earlier, died later that year in India of smallpox, wrote from London, where he and his wife would take ship for Calcutta, about how he and his wife Katie had felt as they left Battle Creek Station. Some of you may have heard the whistle of the train a few minutes ago. They were on the train from Battle Creek Station, and Fred wrote this: as the train sped on its way, there was joy in our hearts, because we were taking the message of the third angel to that ancient land. Later, writing from Ranchi not long before he died, he fervently expressed the hope that God grant that many may see the truth and repent before it is too late. In 1902, after Albert Fisher perished of typhoid fever in Puerto Rico, another missionary, A.J. Hazemer, reported on his last days in the Review and Herald. I quoted part of that earlier, but now I'll quote some more. He wrote that he and Fisher had a final conversation in which Fisher expressed his desire. During this time, he often spoke of the work which he had only begun, and knowing his condition, he pleaded with me not to neglect the work in this island for the many precious souls here. And as we quoted earlier, he seemed to worry that his death would keep others from coming. But this is what Hazemer told him. I assured him that this would affect only the faint-hearted, that the true soldiers would be stimulated to press to the front, 2 or 3 taking the place of 1. And friends, that's what happened. Adventist missionaries pressed forward, 2 or 3 taking the place of 1. We began with Eva Clements, and we will conclude with her, and with her last known letter, written from Burma. In Calcutta, en route to Rangoon, today's Yangon, she visited a temple, and she saw Hindu pilgrims worshipping, she said, before an image of the goddess Kali. And what she saw stayed with her. In a letter to friends, she describes how the people are standing about 7 or 8 feet deep before this huge monster, and the guide cannot make himself heard for the shouting and shuffling in the endeavor to worship this cruel deception of the enemy. But her mind was not on the image, it was on the Indian people, for whom she continues, no privation, no sacrifice is too great for them to behold their God. Many having come long distances to this purpose, and I wonder, did she reflect that she had made a sacrifice, that she had come a long distance for the purpose of serving her God? But her mind turned to how these Indian people might come to know Jesus. She wrote, I pray for deeper consecration on the part of myself and others here, and for an inflow of workers from the homeland to this needy field. There is a great need and much to do. You who are young and can learn the language are the ones who are most wanted. You who hate the works of darkness and will, with the aid of the lamp divine, let his rays penetrate the gloom. Picture these poor people for whom Christ died. How can we let them know? Her last words, her last written words, are powerful. And they describe a need that is still urgent. Picture these poor people for whom Christ died. How can we let them know? Despite the extraordinary growth of the Seventh-day Adventist Church around the world, growth built on the sacrifices of missionaries, there are still billions of people for whom Christ died, but who do not know that he died for them. Before I began speaking, we sang, Seeking the Lost. The lost are found everywhere, but they're found in some places more than others. We have many believers now in China and India where so many missionaries died, and yet we still have to reach, in large part, the people of China and India. We praise God for the members there, but we have still yet to reach most people in China and India. And that's also true for most people in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, North Africa, West Africa, and the people of great cities everywhere, including in Europe, once the homeland of missionaries. And the need is still there. How can we let them know? How can we let them know? How can we let them know that Christ died for them? It will take money. It will take prayers. It will take skillful use of technology and media. But what it will also take is this. It will take Seventh-day Adventists offering their bodies as living sacrifices so that others may know what we know. The everlasting gospel that must be proclaimed to every nation, tribe, tongue, and people. Would you stand with me and we will pray. Father, we thank you for Eva Clements. We thank you for all the others whose names are mentioned here. We thank you for the hundreds of Adventist missionaries who went so that people could know of Jesus. Forgive us where we have forgotten them. Forgive us where we fail to live up to their example. May we be inspired anew to take up the challenge that you gave us in your Great Commission. And now, lifting up our minds to heaven, let us give thanks to the Lord our God, who through his beloved Son has purified us and gathered us together to be a chosen people to himself and to be witnesses to all nations. To him be all praise and glory for all eternity. Amen.
Please be seated for just a couple of minutes. I don't know about you, but my heart was challenged at the presentation that Dr. Trim just gave us about those whose footsteps we'll be walking in this weekend, figuratively.